Wyoming Territory, 1874. The setting sun cast long shadows across the open prairie, turning the wispy clouds to burnt orange as Quentin Shaw rode wearily toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Clearwater Junction. At 26, he'd already spent 8 years riding the range, his boyish face weathered just enough to show he'd earned his spurs the hard way. His lean frame sat easily in the saddle, broad shoulders squared despite the exhaustion of the long cattle drive from Texas. 3 months on the trail had left him dusty and bone-tired, but even trail-worn, there was something in his clear blue eyes that spoke of decency, a rarity in these untamed lands. A light stubble darkened his strong jaw, and though he needed a proper bath, there remained something undeniably handsome about the young cowhand. "Almost there, Dash," he murmured to his chestnut gelding. "Hot meal and a real bed tonight." The horse's ears perked forward as if understanding, but Quentin's mind was elsewhere. Another drive completed, another payday, another town that wasn't home. That was the cowboy's lot he'd long since accepted. The frontier was no place for putting down roots, not for men like him who rode from season to season, following the herds and the work. Every cowboy who lasted knew the rules. Travel light, stay unattached, keep moving. Connections were dangerous out here, they made a man weak, gave him something to lose. Quentin had seen too many good men broken by loss on the frontier. Better to ride alone, keep your own counsel, and never stay long enough for anything to matter too much. Clearwater Junction wasn't much, a general store, saloon, livery, small hotel, and a handful of homes clinging to the edge of civilization. But after 3 months of sleeping under stars with only his fellow drovers for company, it looked like paradise. The Bull's Horn saloon beckoned with the warm glow of lantern light and the promise of whiskey. Quentin dismounted, his legs stiff from the saddle, and looped Dash's reins around the hitching post. A few horses were already tied there, locals most likely. The cattle had been delivered, the crew paid, and most had scattered to the four winds, either riding for home or seeking other work. But Quentin had nowhere particular to be. As he pushed through the swinging doors, the familiar scents of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies greeted him. A handful of men occupied the tables, playing cards or nursing drinks. Behind the bar, a grizzled man with a drooping mustache nodded in acknowledgement. "Whiskey," Quentin said, placing a coin on the scarred wooden surface, "and information about a room." "Hotel's down the street," the barkeep replied, sliding a glass toward him. "Though old Mrs. Simmons rents rooms above her dress shop too, if you're looking to save a few dollars." Quentin nodded his thanks and took a sip, savoring the burn. He hadn't decided how long he'd stay, maybe just long enough to rest up before finding another outfit headed south. Wyoming winters were harsh and smart cowboys followed the weather. The door opened behind him, letting in a gust of cool evening air. Several men at the card tables looked up, and their reactions, widened eyes and straightened postures, made Quentin turn. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey-blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress was simple but well-made, cornflower blue calico that complemented her fair complexion. But it was the determined set of her jaw and the direct gaze from her gray-green eyes that captured attention. She glanced around the saloon until her gaze settled on the barkeep. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady for a young woman entering a saloon alone. "I need to speak with you about the notice." The barkeep Doyle apparently frowned. "Miss Sullivan, this ain't no place for a lady. Whatever business you've got can wait till morning. The notice said you need someone to manage the rooms upstairs and help with serving. I'm here about the position." She stood straighter, clutching a small reticule before her. "Unless you've filled it already." Doyle's frown deepened. "Your brother know you're in here, Kathleen." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed her face. "I'm 20 years old, Mr. Doyle. I don't need Sullivan approval for seeking honest work." Quentin found himself watching the exchange with interest. Women like her, clearly educated from a decent family, didn't typically seek work in saloons, even the respectable ones. There was a story there. "Your pa was a good man," Doyle said, his voice softening. "He wouldn't want his daughter working in a place like this." "My father is dead," she replied, her voice tight. "And unless you want to explain to Sheriff Daniels why you're extending credit to my brother for gambling debts while he drinks away what little we have left, I suggest you consider my application." A tense silence fell over the saloon. Quentin sipped his whiskey, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. The young woman, Kathleen Sullivan, stood unwavering, though he noticed the slight trembling of her hands on her reticule. Doyle finally sighed. "Come back tomorrow morning, we'll talk terms." "Thank you," she said with a small nod. She turned to leave, her gaze briefly meeting Quentin's before she stepped back out into the growing darkness. "Damn Sullivans," Doyle muttered, reaching for a glass to polish. "Proud as they come, even when they're down to nothing." Quentin's curiosity got the better of him. Local family. Was a big name around here once. Old man Sullivan had the largest spread north of Cheyenne before he died last winter. Bad investments, worse luck with the weather. Doyle shook his head. Left those kids with nothing but debt and that rundown place east of town. The boys drinking it all away faster than they can sell it off. Quentin nodded, filing away the information. It wasn't his business, and he'd be moving on soon enough. Still, something about the proud set of Kathleen Sullivan's shoulders as she'd faced down a roomful of men stayed with him as he finished his drink and headed for the hotel. The next morning brought clear skies and a fresh perspective. Quentin had arranged to stay in town for 2 weeks while deciding his next move. He'd never been this far north before, and part of him wondered if Wyoming might offer opportunities beyond drifting with the herds. After a proper bath and a visit to the barber, he felt almost civilized again. His trail clothes had been washed, his boots polished, and with a clean-shaven face, he looked younger than his years. The general store provided necessities, and by midday, he'd made the acquaintance of several locals who mentioned ranches that might be hiring for permanent positions. It was outside the general store that he saw Kathleen Sullivan again. She was leaving Doyle's establishment, her expression hard to read. On impulse, Quentin tipped his hat as she passed. "Miss Sullivan," he said politely. She paused, studying him with guarded eyes. "Do I know you, sir?" "Quentin Shaw, ma'am. I was at the saloon last night when you came in." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The cowboy at the bar. You clean up well, Mr. Shaw." "Thank you, ma'am. Did you secure the position?" Something like resignation crossed her face. "I start tomorrow." Mr. Doyle was reluctant, but practical considerations won out. "Congratulations," Quentin offered, though he wasn't sure if congratulations were appropriate for a young lady taking work in a saloon, even if it was just managing rooms and serving food. "It's honest work," she replied, as if reading his thoughts, "and beggars can't be choosers in Clearwater Junction." "I didn't mean to imply." "Of course you did, everyone will," she sighed, softening slightly. "But I appreciate the courtesy of pretending otherwise." Quentin found himself admiring her directness. "I've found honest work comes in all forms on the frontier, Miss Sullivan. No shame in doing what needs doing." She studied him for a moment, then offered the ghost of a smile. "You're not from around here." "Texas originally. Been driving herds north the past few years." "Will you be staying in Clearwater long?" "Couple of weeks at least. Maybe longer if the right opportunity presents itself." She nodded, glancing toward the eastern edge of town. "Well, welcome to our little corner of Wyoming, Mr. Shaw. I hope you find what you're looking for." As she walked away, Quentin found himself watching her retreating figure longer than was proper. There was something compelling about Kathleen Sullivan, a quiet dignity despite her circumstances. But such thoughts were dangerous. He'd be moving on soon enough, and attachment of any kind was a liability in his line of work. That evening, Quentin returned to the Bull's Horn for dinner, curious despite himself to see the establishment where Miss Sullivan would soon be working. The place was busier than the previous night, with several tables occupied by local ranchers and a few trail hands. Doyle nodded in recognition as Quentin took a seat at a table near the back. "Stew's decent tonight," the barkeep called over. Cook actually remembered the salt. Quentin ordered the stew and a beer, settling in to observe the room. The saloon was rough but not rowdy. the kind of place where men came to drink and play cards, not to raise hell. That explained why Doyle had even considered hiring someone like Kathleen Sullivan. As he ate, Quentin overheard snippets of conversation, complaints about cattle prices, gossip about neighboring ranches, and speculation about the coming winter. One name caught his attention: Sullivan. Heard Patrick Sullivan lost another 40 acres to Welland yesterday, a weathered rancher was saying. Boy can't hold his liquor or his cards. Shame what's happened to that family, his companion replied. Old man Sullivan would be turning in his grave. Girls taken work at Doyle's place, the first man said, lowering his voice. Imagine that, a Sullivan serving drinks to the likes of us. Times change, pride don't feed the hungry. Quentin kept his expression neutral, but their words confirmed what he'd suspected. The Sullivans had fallen far and fast. It wasn't an uncommon tale in the West, where fortunes could change with a bad winter or a failed harvest. Still, he found himself unexpectedly troubled by the thought of Kathleen Sullivan's plight. Over the next few days, Quentin established a routine. Mornings were spent at the livery, helping the aging proprietor in exchange for Dash's board. Afternoons, he'd ride the surrounding countryside, getting a feel for the land and visiting nearby ranches. Evenings invariably led him back to the Bull's Horn, where Kathleen Sullivan had indeed taken up her position. She managed her duties with quiet efficiency, moving between tables with a tray of drinks or climbing the stairs to attend to the rooms above. She kept her interactions brief but polite, deftly deflecting the occasional too-familiar comment from patrons. Quentin noticed how she kept her distance, physically and emotionally, from everyone in the establishment, including Doyle. It was on his 5th night in town that circumstances finally brought them into direct conversation again. The saloon was quieter than usual, a heavy rain keeping many of the regulars at home. Quentin had claimed his usual table, nursing a whiskey while reviewing a map of the territory. "Planning your escape route, Mr. Shaw," Kathleen's voice startled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find her standing beside his table, a cloth in hand. "Just getting my bearings, Miss Sullivan. You've been here nearly a week. I'd have thought you'd know every trail out of town by now." "Maybe I'm considering trails that lead to places, not away from them." A hint of a smile touched her lips. A cowboy looking to settle, that would be a novelty. "I didn't say I was settling," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "But a man gets tired of living in the saddle eventually." She hesitated, glancing toward the bar where Doyle was busy with inventory. After a moment's consideration, she sat. "My father used to say cowboys were like tumbleweeds. They only stopped rolling when something snagged them." "Wise man, your father." "He was," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "Until the last few years, then. Well, wisdom abandoned him when it came to business matters." Quentin sensed the pain behind her words. "I heard about your family's ranch, I'm sorry." Her posture stiffened. Clearwater loves its gossip. Small towns always do. It's their primary export. That earned him a genuine smile, brief but transformative. For a moment he glimpsed the young woman she might have been under different circumstances, carefree, perhaps even flirtatious. "What about you, Mr. Shaw? What's your story? Texas is a long way from Wyoming." "Not much to tell. Orphaned young, raised by an uncle who taught me to ride and rope. Started working cattle drives at 18, been doing it ever since." "Family?" she asked. "None to speak of, couple of friends scattered across the territories." He shrugged. "Keeps life simple." "Simple," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "I used to think I wanted adventure and complexity. Now simple sounds rather appealing." A shout from the bar interrupted their conversation. Doyle was waving her over to help with a group of newly arrived customers. "Duty calls," she said, rising gracefully. "Enjoy your map, Mr. Shaw." "Quentin," he corrected. "If we're going to keep running into each other in this small town, might as well use my name." She considered this, then nodded. "Kathleen," she offered in return, before hurrying to attend to the new patrons. That brief exchange marked a subtle shift in their interactions. Over the following days, Kathleen would occasionally pause at his table for a few moments of conversation. He learned that she had been educated in Denver before her family's financial troubles called her home. She discovered his talent for breaking horses and his unexpected fondness for poetry, picked up from a literature-loving trail boss years earlier. These moments were brief, inconsequential on the surface, yet Quentin found himself looking forward to them with an eagerness that should have alarmed him. He was staying in Clearwater longer than planned, extending his room rental at the hotel under the pretense of exploring job opportunities. The truth was more troubling. Something about Kathleen Sullivan had snagged him like the tumbleweeds her father had described. It was dangerous thinking. He'd seen men abandon the freedom of the trail for the promise of love, only to find themselves trapped in lives of bitter compromise. The frontier was no place for romance, not for men like him who had nothing to offer but calloused hands and uncertain futures. 2 weeks stretched into 3, and Quentin could no longer ignore the restlessness that typically drove him onward. Yet he remained in Clearwater, taking odd jobs and telling himself he was just waiting for the right opportunity. The opportunity, when it came, wasn't what he expected. It was late afternoon when Sheriff Daniels found Quentin at the livery. The lawman, a gray-haired veteran with a perpetually tired expression, got straight to the point. "Heard you're good with horses, Shaw." Quentin nodded, continuing to brush Dash's coat. "Fair hand, yes. Got a situation. Patrick Sullivan's managed to get himself thrown in the Welland County Jail for drunk and disorderly. His sister's trying to raise bail money, selling off the last of their furniture from what I understand." Quentin stilled. "What does that have to do with horses?" "Sullivan Place still has 3 good horses in the barn. Quality stock worth good money in Cheyenne. Miss Sullivan mentioned you might be willing to help get them there. Train's leaving tomorrow morning." Quentin frowned. "She asked for me specifically." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Not in so many words. She was asking around for someone trustworthy to make the trip. Your name came up." It was a reasonable request. Kathleen needed money quickly, and horses would fetch more in Cheyenne than in Clearwater. Still, something felt off about the arrangement. Why not sell them locally? "Everyone knows she's desperate. They'd rob her blind on the price." Sheriff Daniels sighed. "Look, I've known those kids since they were born. Patrick's a fool, but Kathleen doesn't deserve what's happening. She's proud, though wouldn't ask you directly." Quentin considered his options. Common sense said to refuse. Getting involved in local troubles was exactly the sort of entanglement he avoided. But the thought of Kathleen struggling alone to save her wastrel brother stirred something in him he'd long thought dormant. "I'll help," he said finally, "but I need to speak with Miss Sullivan first." The Sullivan Ranch was a shadow of what it once had been. The main house, a substantial 2-story structure, showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, a sagging porch step, an empty corral that had once held prize cattle. As Quentin rode up the long drive, he could see why the family's fall from prosperity had been the talk of the territory. Kathleen emerged from the barn as he approached, wiping her hands on a rag. She wore a simple work dress with her sleeves rolled up, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. Seeing her in this setting, away from the saloon, Quentin was struck anew by her quiet beauty. "Mr. Shaw," she called, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you out this way?" He dismounted, leading Dash by the reins. "Sheriff Daniels mentioned you might need help getting some horses to Cheyenne." A flush colored her cheeks. "I see the sheriff has been meddling again," she sighed, gesturing toward the barn. "It's true I need to sell them, but I wouldn't presume to ask for your assistance." "You didn't." "I'm offering." She studied him, wariness battling with hope in her expression. "It's at least 2 days' travel each way. You'd be doing this out of charity." "Not charity," he corrected. "I'd take a fair percentage of the sale." "It's business, plain and simple." They both knew it wasn't that simple, but the fiction allowed her pride to remain intact. 10%, she offered. 20, he countered. "And I'll cover my own expenses." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "The train leaves at 8 tomorrow. We should have the horses at the station by 7. Way, I'm coming with you. Her tone brooked no argument. They're my horses, and I'll see to the sale myself. Quentin had expected as much, though the prospect of traveling alone with Kathleen brought complications he hadn't anticipated. It's your decision, he said carefully. But the journey won't be easy. Few things worth doing are, Mr. Shaw. She gestured toward the house. Would you like some coffee before you head back to town? It's the least I can offer for your trouble. The interior of the Sullivan home told a stark story. What had clearly once been a well-appointed residence now stood half-empty, with rectangular patches of unfaded wallpaper marking where paintings or furniture had recently been removed. Despite this, the kitchen where Kathleen led him was scrupulously clean, the coffee she served in mismatched cups hot and strong. Your brother, Quentin began cautiously, is this his first trouble with the law? Kathleen's expression tightened. Patrick has many qualities, self-restraint isn't among them. She stared into her cup. He wasn't raised for this, neither of us were. When father died, the debts, it was overwhelming. Patrick tried to gamble our way out. You can imagine how that went. And you? I do what needs doing, she said simply. We still have this house and the land it sits on. If I can get Patrick out of jail and keep him sober long enough, maybe we can start rebuilding. Her determination was admirable, if misguided. Quentin had seen enough of Patrick Sullivan's type to know that her brother was more likely to drag her down than help her up, but it wasn't his place to say so. The horses look well cared for, he observed instead. They're the last of father's prized bloodstock. Patrick wanted to sell them months ago, but I wouldn't let him. I knew we'd need them eventually, but I wanted to wait until we could get fair value. She smiled ruefully. That time has apparently arrived. As Quentin prepared to leave, Kathleen walked him to the porch. The setting sun bathed the neglected property in golden light, lending it a beauty that belied its decline. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for this, but for not pitying me. Everyone in town looks at me with such sympathy. It's almost worse than the gossip. You're not someone to be pitied, Kathleen, he replied honestly. You're facing hard times with more dignity than most would manage. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, something unspoken passed between them. Quentin felt a dangerous pull toward her, a desire to protect, to comfort, to stay. It was precisely the sort of feeling he'd spent years avoiding. Tomorrow at 7, he said abruptly, breaking the moment. I'll bring supplies for the journey. She nodded, composure restored. Until tomorrow, then. As he rode back to town, Quentin tried to convince himself that he was simply doing a good turn, the kind any decent man would offer. But the lie rang hollow even in his own mind. The truth was more troubling. In just 3 weeks, Kathleen Sullivan had become someone who mattered to him, and on the frontier, caring was the shortest route to heartache. The journey to Cheyenne began at dawn, with a light mist hanging over the rolling Wyoming landscape. Kathleen arrived at the station precisely on time, leading 3 magnificent horses that even to Quentin's experienced eye represented exceptional quality. She herself was dressed practically in a split riding skirt and sturdy boots, her hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. You came prepared, he noted approvingly as he helped load the animals into the stock car. I grew up on a ranch, Mr. Shaw. I know how to travel. There was a hint of defensiveness in her tone that suggested others had questioned her capabilities before. Quentin, he reminded her. And I never doubted it. The train journey passed uneventfully, the two of them sharing the passenger car with a handful of travelers. They spoke little, Kathleen alternating between staring out the window and checking on the horses at every stop. By late afternoon, the train pulled into Cheyenne, a bustling frontier city that made Clearwater Junction look like the small outpost it was. We'll stable the horses tonight, Quentin explained as they disembarked. The livestock auction isn't until tomorrow morning. Kathleen nodded, surveying the busy streets with careful eyes. She had clearly been to Cheyenne before, but perhaps not under these circumstances. A young woman with valuable horses and no family protection. I've arranged rooms at the Western Hotel, he continued. It's respectable and close to the auction yards. If she was concerned about propriety, she didn't show it. That's sensible. Thank you. The hotel was indeed respectable, if modest. Quentin secured adjoining rooms on the second floor, close enough for safety, separate enough for propriety. After seeing to the horses at a nearby livery, they returned for a simple dinner in the hotel's dining room. It was over their meal that Kathleen finally relaxed enough to speak openly. "I appreciate your discretion about all this," she said, her voice low. "Most of Clearwater thinks I'm just serving drinks at Doyle's place, not traveling to Cheyenne with a cowboy I barely know." Quentin smiled slightly. "Is that what we are, barely acquainted?" "You know what I mean, by the standards of proper society." "Proper society doesn't extend much past the Mississippi," he interrupted gently. "Out here, people do what's necessary and sensible. You needed help with the horses, I was available and trustworthy. There's nothing improper about it." She studied him across the table. "Is that really how you see it, just a business arrangement between acquaintances?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Quentin knew the safe answer, the one that maintained the comfortable fiction they'd established, but something in her direct gaze demanded honesty. "No," he admitted, "that's not how I see it." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "How do you see it, then?" "I see a woman I've come to admire facing difficulties with remarkable courage. I see myself wanting to help, not out of charity or business, but because—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Because in 3 weeks you've become someone I care about, more than is wise, probably." Kathleen's expression softened, vulnerability replacing her usual guardedness. "Why isn't it wise to care?" "You know why. I'm a drifter with nothing to my name but a good horse and whatever I can carry in my saddlebags. You're trying to save your family's legacy. Our paths are heading in different directions." "Are they?" she asked quietly. "You've been in Clearwater for nearly a month now. That's not very drifter-like behavior." Quentin hadn't expected her to challenge him so directly. "I've been considering my options." "Because of me?" The directness of the question was startling. He met her gaze steadily. "Partly, but also because I'm getting tired of having no place to call home." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Kathleen broke it with a slight smile. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." As they walked up the stairs to their rooms, Quentin was acutely aware of her presence beside him. The faint scent of lavender, the rustle of her skirt, the quiet determination in her posture despite her evident fatigue. At her door she paused, key in hand. "Thank you, Quentin, not just for helping with the horses but for your honesty. It's a rare quality these days." "Good night, Kathleen," he replied, resisting the impulse to reach for her hand. As he lay in his narrow bed that night, listening to the muffled sounds of the city through the thin walls, Quentin confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling in love with Kathleen Sullivan. It was foolish, impractical, potentially heartbreaking, and completely unstoppable. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the auction. Kathleen appeared at breakfast looking refreshed, her honey-blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her blue dress simple but flattering. Together they walked to the livery and prepared the horses for the short journey to the auction yards. The auction itself exceeded their expectations. The Sullivan horses, with their impressive bloodlines and evident quality, attracted significant interest from buyers. Kathleen handled the negotiations with surprising skill, fielding questions about lineage and training with confident knowledge. By midday, all 3 horses had sold for prices well above what they would have fetched in Clearwater. "You're quite the businesswoman," Quentin observed as they left the auction house, Kathleen carrying a substantial bank draft tucked securely in her reticule. "Father taught us both," she replied. Though Patrick preferred the social aspects of ranching to the business side. She paused, her expression clouding. "This money will free him from jail, pay off the most pressing debts, and perhaps give us a small start toward rebuilding. It won't be enough for what we once had, but it might be enough for what we need." "And what do you need, Kathleen?" Quentin asked, the question deeper than it appeared on the surface. She glanced at him, something vulnerable in her eyes. Security, a chance to build something lasting. I'm tired of watching everything slip away piece by piece. They had several hours before their train back to Clearwater. By unspoken agreement, they spent it walking through Cheyenne, window shopping and observing the bustling frontier city. Away from the familiar eyes of Clearwater, they moved with a new freedom, occasionally allowing their hands to brush as they walked side by side. It was during this interlude, as they paused to watch a street musician, that Kathleen spoke the words that would change everything. "What if you didn't go back?" she asked suddenly. Quentin turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "To drifting, to cattle drives and sleeping under stars." Her eyes met his, direct and challenging. "What if you found a reason to stay in one place?" The implications of her question hung between them. Quentin chose his words carefully. "I've been considering it. Clearwater has certain attractions that make the idea appealing." "Such as?" "You know what I mean, Kathleen." She shook her head slightly. "I need to hear you say it plainly." His heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment to retreat to safety, to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him for years. Instead, he took a step into unknown territory. "You," he said simply, "you're the reason I've stayed in Clearwater, the reason I'm considering putting down roots for the first time in my life." A smile bloomed across her face, transforming her features. "That wasn't so difficult, was it?" "Terrifying, actually," he admitted with a half-smile. "What happens now?" "Now we go back to Clearwater. I get my brother out of jail and hope he stays sober long enough to help me make some decisions about the ranch." Her expression grew serious. "And you decide if what you feel is strong enough to overcome your wandering nature." It was a fair challenge. She wasn't asking for promises he might not be able to keep. Instead, she was acknowledging the reality of who he was while offering the possibility of something more. "And us?" he asked. "Us," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I suppose that depends on a great many things. But I believe there could be an us if we both wanted enough." The return journey to Clearwater felt different, charged with possibility yet tempered by reality. They spoke of practical matters. Kathleen's plans for the Sullivan property, Quentin's job prospects in the area, the logistics of Patrick's release from jail. Beneath these conversations ran a current of deeper connection, occasional glances and brief touches affirming what words had begun to acknowledge. Upon their arrival, Sheriff Daniels met them at the station with news. Patrick Sullivan had been released the previous day after a local rancher named Welland had posted his bail. "Welland?" Kathleen's face paled. "Edmund Welland posted my brother's bail." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Said it was a professional courtesy, given your father's standing in the community." "He wants our land," she said flatly. "Everyone knows it. He's been buying up every parcel that borders his property." "Likely so," the sheriff agreed. But Patrick was mighty glad to get out of that cell, no questions asked. Kathleen's expression hardened. "Where is my brother now?" "Home, I expect. Welland's man drove him there yesterday afternoon." Quentin recognized the fear beneath Kathleen's composure. "I'll accompany you to your ranch," he offered. She nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Sheriff, for meeting us. We should go directly home." The ride to the Sullivan Ranch was tense, Kathleen pushing her borrowed mount to a pace just short of reckless. Quentin kept up easily, concern growing as they approached the property and saw smoke rising from the chimney. "At least someone's home," he observed as they dismounted in the yard. Kathleen didn't respond, striding toward the house with purpose. The front door opened before she reached it, revealing a young man who bore a striking resemblance to her. Patrick Sullivan was perhaps 24, with the same honey-blonde hair and fine features as his sister, though his face showed the effects of hard living and harder drinking. "Katie," he called, his voice carrying a forced joviality. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing family matters." Kathleen froze on the porch steps. "We." Patrick stepped aside, revealing another figure in the doorway. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, expensively dressed with a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Miss Sullivan," the man said smoothly. "Edmund Wellen, a pleasure to finally meet you properly." Quentin sensed Kathleen's tension as she straightened her spine. "Mr. Wellen. I understand I have you to thank for my brother's release." "A small courtesy," Wellen replied with a dismissive wave. "Neighbors should help neighbors." "We're hardly neighbors," Kathleen countered. "Not until you started buying up surrounding properties." Wellen smiled thinly. "Direct like your father, I admired that about him." He gestured toward the house. "Won't you join us inside? Your brother and I were discussing a proposition that might interest you." Patrick's expression held a mixture of discomfort and forced enthusiasm that raised immediate alarm bells for Quentin. Whatever deal had been discussed in their absence, he suspected it wouldn't favor the Sullivans. "My sisters had a long journey," Patrick said quickly. "Perhaps we should continue this another day." "Nonsense," Kathleen replied, her gaze fixed on Wellen. "I'm curious to hear what proposition is so important it couldn't wait for my return." She glanced at Quentin. "Mr. Shaw, would you join us?" Wellen's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Quentin. "And you are?" "A friend of the family," Quentin replied evenly. "Quentin Shaw." Something like recognition flickered in Welland's expression. "The cowboy who's been lingering in Clearwater. I've heard of you." His tone suggested he'd heard nothing particularly impressive. The interior of the house felt charged with tension as they gathered in the parlor. Despite the missing furniture, the room retained a dignity that spoke of better days. Kathleen remained standing, refusing Welland's invitation to sit. "You mentioned a proposition," she prompted. Welland settled into one of the remaining chairs with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "It's quite straightforward. I'm prepared to purchase your property, house, land, outbuildings, at a fair market price. Given your circumstances and the property's condition, it's a generous offer." "Our land isn't for sale," Kathleen replied without hesitation. Patrick stepped forward, his expression pleading. "Katie, listen to him. It's a good offer, enough to clear our debts and give us both a fresh start somewhere else. This is our home, Patrick, our legacy." "It's a millstone," her brother countered. "We can't work this land ourselves, we can't even afford to hire help." "Be practical." Quentin watched the dynamics unfold, noting how Wellen observed the siblings' disagreement with barely concealed satisfaction. This was clearly his strategy: drive a wedge between brother and sister, then exploit Patrick's weakness to gain what he wanted. "Miss Sullivan," Wellen interjected smoothly, "your brother sees reason. The frontier is changing. Small holdings like yours are being absorbed into larger operations because that's the only way to survive. It's simply progress. Strange how your version of progress always seems to benefit you, Mr. Wellen," Kathleen replied coolly. Welland's facade of geniality slipped momentarily. "I've made your brother an offer that expires tomorrow. I suggest you discuss it between yourselves and come to a sensible decision." He rose, reaching for his hat. "I'll call again in the morning for your answer." After Welland's departure, the tension in the room shifted but didn't dissipate. Patrick paced nervously, casting frequent glances at Quentin as if uncertain how to proceed with an outsider present. "You had no right to negotiate with him behind my back," Kathleen said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I had every right," Patrick countered. "This property belongs to both of us. And I'm trying to save us from complete ruin. By selling our home to a man who's been systematically forcing every small rancher in the territory off their land." She shook her head in disbelief. "Father would be ashamed." Patrick's face flushed with anger. "Father left us nothing but debt and unrealistic expectations. I'm being practical." "You're being weak," she shot back. "Welland paid your bail to manipulate you, and you fell for it completely." Quentin cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should leave you to discuss this privately." Both Sullivans turned to him, as if suddenly remembering his presence. Patrick looked relieved at the suggestion, but Kathleen shook her head. "Stay, please," she said. "I'd value your perspective." She turned back to her brother. "I sold the horses in Cheyenne." The money will clear your gambling debts and give us operating capital. Patrick's expression shifted from defiance to surprise. How much? Enough, she replied cryptically. But not if you keep drinking and gambling it away. Her brother had the grace to look ashamed. I know I've made mistakes. This isn't about mistakes, it's about choices. Kathleen's voice softened slightly. Patrick, I know you're trying to find an easy solution, but selling to Wellen isn't the answer. Give me 6 months to turn things around. If I can't do it by then, we'll reconsider. Patrick looked conflicted, glancing between his sister and Quentin. Finally, he sighed heavily. 6 months won't change anything, Katie, but I won't sign without your agreement. He reached for his hat. I need some air, don't wait up. As the door closed behind him, Kathleen's composure finally cracked. She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Quentin approached cautiously, uncertain whether to comfort her or give her space. He's headed straight for Doyle's place, she said without looking up. And whatever progress I've made will be undone in a single night of drinking. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Quentin offered gently. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He's all the family I have left. That doesn't obligate you to go down with him. Quentin knelt beside her chair. Kathleen, what do you want? Not for Patrick, not for your father's legacy, for yourself. The question seemed to startle her. I want to stay, to make this work, to build something that lasts. She gestured around the half-empty room, even if it's not what it once was. Then fight for that, he said simply. With or without Patrick's help. Their eyes met, and Quentin felt that dangerous pull again. The desire to protect her, to stay, to build something alongside her. Before he could speak, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a brief, impulsive kiss. I'm sorry, she whispered as she pulled away. That was forward of me. Quentin's heart hammered in his chest. Don't apologize, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. I've wanted to do that since Cheyenne. A tentative smile curved her lips. And what else do you want, Quentin Shaw? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Before he could answer, a sound from outside caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Kathleen rose, moving to the window. It's too soon for Patrick to return, she said, concern edging her voice. Quentin joined her, peering through the fading evening light to see 3 riders approaching the house. He recognized the lead figure immediately, Edmund Wellen, returning with what appeared to be hired men. This can't be good, he muttered, instinctively placing himself between Kathleen and the window. What does he want now? She wondered, alarm evident in her tone. Stay inside, Quentin instructed, moving toward the door. I'll handle this. Wellen and his men reined in before the porch, dust settling around them in the golden light of sunset. The rancher's earlier pretense of geniality had vanished, replaced by cold determination. Mr. Shaw, he called, remaining mounted. I believe your business here is concluded. Quentin stood firm on the porch. My business is my own concern, Wellen. Not when it interferes with mine. Wellen nodded to his men, who spread out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Miss Sullivan needs time to consider my offer without distractions. Behind him, Quentin heard the door open as Kathleen stepped onto the porch. I've considered your offer, Mr. Wellen, she said clearly. The answer is no. Wellen's expression darkened. Perhaps you misunderstand your situation, Miss Sullivan. Your brother has already agreed in principle. He merely lacks the courage to stand against your stubbornness. My brother doesn't have sole authority to sell, Kathleen countered, and he won't be bullied into it either. Bullied, Wellen affected an expression of wounded innocence. I'm offering good money for land that's barely productive. Most would consider that generosity. Most would recognize a vulture when they see one, Quentin interjected, his patience wearing thin. Wellen's facade dropped completely. Mind your place, cowboy. Drifters like you have no stake in these matters. Mr. Shaw is my guest, Kathleen said, stepping forward to stand beside Quentin. And you are not welcome here, Mr. Wellen. Please leave. For a tense moment, Wellen seemed to consider pressing the issue. His men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Quentin tensed, acutely aware that he was outgunned and that Kathleen was dangerously exposed. Finally, Wellen offered a cold smile. "As you wish, but consider this, your brother is currently enjoying my hospitality at the Bull's Horn. He finds himself in another, financial predicament. One that might influence his perspective on our business arrangement." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness. "Good evening, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Shaw." As the riders departed, Kathleen gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. "He's going to use Patrick against me." Quentin nodded grimly. "That appears to be his strategy." "I have to go to town," she said, turning toward the house. "I need to find Patrick before he does something irreversible." "We'll go together," Quentin insisted. "But Kathleen, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Patrick may have already made his choice." Her expression hardened with determination. "Then I'll unmake it for him. He's not thinking clearly." The ride to Clearwater was tense, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rolling landscape. Kathleen pushed her mount hard, her fear for her brother evident in every taut line of her body. Quentin kept pace, his mind racing through scenarios, none of them promising. The Bull's Horn was crowded when they arrived, the usual evening crowd supplemented by cowboys passing through town. Kathleen dismounted before Quentin could offer assistance, striding toward the entrance with single-minded purpose. Inside, the scene confirmed their worst fears. Patrick Sullivan sat at a table with Wellen and several other men, cards and money scattered before them. Even from a distance, Quentin could see that Patrick was thoroughly intoxicated, swaying slightly in his chair as he reached for his glass. "Patrick," Kathleen called, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. The young man looked up, his expression cycling rapidly from surprise to guilt to defiance. "Katie," he slurred. "Come to join the celebration." "What are you celebrating?" she asked, approaching the table. Wellen smiled coldly. "Your brother has had a change of heart regarding my offer. We're just finalizing the details." Kathleen's gaze swept over the table, noting the documents partially hidden beneath playing cards. "You're having him sign papers while he's drunk." "Business doesn't wait for sobriety," Wellen replied smoothly. "Patrick understands what he's agreeing to." "I doubt that very much." She turned to her brother. "Patrick, come home. Whatever you've signed, we can undo it." Patrick's expression hardened with the peculiar stubbornness of the intoxicated. "Don't treat me like a child, Katie. I'm doing what's necessary, what you're too stubborn to see." "You're being manipulated," she countered. "Wellen is using your weakness to get our land." "My weakness?" Patrick rose unsteadily, anger flashing in his eyes. "I'm being practical, something Father never taught us." Quentin sensed the situation deteriorating rapidly. The other patrons had fallen silent, watching the drama unfold with the avid interest of those seeking entertainment in a small town. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," he suggested, stepping forward. Wellen's cold gaze fixed on him. "Still interfering, Mr. Shaw. I admire persistence, but you're overstepping." "I decide who's welcome in my business," Doyle interjected from behind the bar. "And right now, none of you are particularly welcome if you're going to cause a disturbance." Patrick swayed, reaching for the table to steady himself. "No disturbance, just family matters." His bleary gaze settled on Quentin. "And you're not family, Cowboy." "Patrick, please," Kathleen implored. "Come home. We'll discuss everything tomorrow when you're thinking clearly." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly," he insisted, his voice rising. "Wellen's offering enough to pay off all our debts and give us both a fresh start. Why can't you see that's the best option?" "Because it's not what Father would have wanted," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. Patrick's face contorted with anger. "Father's dead, and his poor decisions are why we're in this mess." The cruel words hung in the air, and Kathleen flinched as if struck. Quentin stepped closer to her, a silent show of support that didn't go unnoticed by Wellen or Patrick. "I see how it is," Patrick said, his gaze shifting between Quentin and his sister. "You've found yourself a new protector. Is that why you're so eager to keep the property?" Planning to play house with your cowboy. That's enough, Quentin warned, his patience reaching its limit. Welland smiled coldly. The drifter and the fallen socialite, how romantic. But romance doesn't pay debts, Miss Sullivan. I sold the horses, Kathleen countered, her voice steady despite the provocation. We have enough to clear the immediate debts and begin rebuilding. Patrick laughed bitterly. Those horses were mine as much as yours. You had no right. I had every right when you abandoned your responsibilities to drink and gamble, she interrupted. Someone had to act. The tension in the room was palpable, the audience of patrons watching with bated breath. Quentin positioned himself protectively near Kathleen, noting that Welland's men had subtly moved to block the exit. Let's simplify matters, Welland said finally. Patrick has signed a preliminary agreement. I'm prepared to conclude our business now with a bank draft for the full amount. He reached into his coat, withdrawing papers and a folded document. All that's needed is your signature, Miss Sullivan, and this unfortunate situation can be resolved. I won't sign, Kathleen stated firmly. Patrick's expression darkened further. Then I'll petition the court for sole authority. You're being unreasonable, Katie. I'm being loyal to what matters, she replied, something you seem to have forgotten. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sudden arrival of Sheriff Daniels. The lawman entered the saloon with the weary resignation of someone who had anticipated trouble. Evening, folks, he said, his gaze taking in the tableau before him. Heard there might be a situation developing. Welland's expression remained composed. Nothing that concerns the law, Sheriff, just a family disagreement about business matters. Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly. Well, in my experience, family disagreements conducted in public places after dark tend to escalate in unfortunate ways. He turned to Patrick. Mr. Sullivan, I think you've had enough excitement for one day. Why don't you head home with your sister? Patrick wavered, conflict evident in his face as he looked between Welland and the sheriff. Finally, he reached for the papers on the table. I've made my decision. Not tonight, you haven't, Sheriff Daniels countered firmly. Whatever business you're conducting, it can wait until morning when heads are clearer. For a moment, tension hung in the balance. Then Welland smiled thinly, gathering the papers into a neat stack. The sheriff speaks wisely. We'll continue our discussion tomorrow. He fixed Kathleen with a pointed look. I suggest you use the intervening hours to reconsider your position, Miss Sullivan. As Welland and his men departed, Patrick slumped back into his chair, the fight gone out of him. Kathleen moved to his side, her anger giving way to concern despite everything. Come home, Patrick, she said softly, please. With Quentin's help, they managed to get Patrick onto his horse and began the slow journey back to the Sullivan ranch. The young man alternated between surly silence and maudlin apologies, the effects of alcohol making him unpredictable. He almost had me sign it all away, Patrick mumbled as they neared home. Said it was the only sensible option. Kathleen rode alongside her brother, ready to steady him if necessary. Welland doesn't care what's sensible for us, only what benefits him. But maybe he's right, Patrick insisted, a note of desperation in his voice. Maybe we are just delaying the inevitable. Nothing's inevitable, Quentin interjected, not if you're willing to work for a different outcome. Patrick squinted at him through the darkness. Easy for you to say, drifter. You can always move on when things get difficult. The accusation struck uncomfortably close to Quentin's own doubts. His instinct had always been to avoid entanglement, to maintain the freedom to leave when situations became complicated. Yet here he was, deeply involved in the Sullivan struggles, with no desire to ride away. The Sullivan house loomed dark against the night sky as they approached. Quentin helped Patrick dismount and steadied him as they entered, while Kathleen moved ahead to light the lamps. The soft glow revealed a home that, despite its reduced circumstances, still held traces of former elegance. Patrick collapsed onto a sofa in the parlor, his energy suddenly depleted. I've made a mess of everything, he mumbled, more to himself than to his companions. Kathleen sighed, her expression a complex mixture of frustration and compassion. Get some sleep, Patrick. We'll talk in the morning. As her brother's eyes closed, Kathleen gestured for Quentin to follow her to the kitchen. She moved with the weariness of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Thank you, she said quietly, leaning against the worn wooden table. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Quentin shook his head. You would have handled it. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Strong enough to fight my brother Wellen and the entire town's expectations, she smiled humorlessly. I'm not so certain. I am. Quentin stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. But you don't have to fight alone. Her eyes met his, searching. What are you saying, Quentin? It was the moment of truth, the crossroads he'd been approaching since first seeing her in Doyle's saloon. Every instinct honed by years on the frontier warned him to step back, to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him for so long. But his heart, long dormant, pushed him forward. I'm saying I want to stay, he said simply, to help you rebuild if you'll let me, to see if what's growing between us might take root and flourish. Kathleen's expression softened, hope warring with caution in her eyes. You're a drifter by your own admission. What happens when the wind changes and the open trail calls to you again? It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself countless times over the past weeks. I've been riding the trail because I had nowhere that felt like home, he answered honestly. Nothing worth staying for. That's changing. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her gray-green eyes, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. Are you certain? Because I can't afford to build hopes on shifting sand, Quentin. Not now. Instead of answering with words, he closed the distance between them, cradling her face gently in his hands as he kissed her. Unlike their earlier tentative kiss, this one held promise, deep, certain, and unhurried. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kathleen's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. I should go, Quentin said reluctantly. It's late, and tongues will wag if I stay longer. She nodded, though her hand still rested lightly on his chest. Will you come tomorrow? Patrick will be difficult when he wakes, and Wellen won't wait long to press his advantage. I'll be here, he promised, first thing in the morning. As he rode back to town under a canopy of stars, Quentin felt a strange sense of peace despite the troubles ahead. For the first time in years, he was riding toward something rather than away, and the difference was profound. The dawn brought clear skies and renewed determination. Quentin arrived at the Sullivan Ranch early, having spent much of the night formulating a plan. He found Kathleen already awake, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as she watched the sun rise over the eastern hills. You're up early, he observed, dismounting and securing Dash to the hitching post. She offered a tired smile. I barely slept, too much to think about. Her gaze drifted toward the house. Patrick's still unconscious. I checked on him an hour ago. Quentin joined her on the porch. Accepting the cup of coffee she poured from a pot kept warm on a small brazier. I've been thinking about your situation, he said carefully, and I believe there might be a way forward that doesn't involve selling to Wellen. Kathleen's expression brightened with cautious hope. I'm listening. The money from the horses, how much exactly did you get? Enough to clear Patrick's gambling debts and the most pressing of father's outstanding accounts, she replied, with perhaps a small amount left for operating costs. Quentin nodded, processing this information. Not enough to hire hands or restock the ranch properly. No, she admitted. That would require more capital than we have access to. What if you had a partner? Quentin suggested. Someone willing to invest labor and some modest savings in exchange for a share in future profits. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You mean yourself? I've been saving most of my earnings for years, he explained. It's not a fortune, but combined with your land and what's left of your funds, it could be enough to make a start. I know cattle, horses, and range management. With hard work and some luck, we could rebuild the Sullivan Ranch. Kathleen studied him, her expression guarded despite the hope in her eyes. As a business arrangement. As a beginning, Quentin replied honestly. What it might grow into, well, that would be for us to determine together. Before she could respond, the front door opened to reveal Patrick, disheveled and pale but surprisingly steady on his feet. His expression as he regarded Quentin was unreadable. "How long have you been listening?" Kathleen asked, rising to her feet. "Long enough," Patrick replied, his voice rough from the previous night's excesses. He stepped onto the porch, squinting in the morning light. "You're proposing a partnership." Quentin met the younger man's gaze directly. "I am, a fair one with terms we all agree to." Patrick studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "You hardly know us. This land is struggling at best, failed at worst." "I believe it has potential," Quentin answered, "and I believe in your sister's determination to make it work." Something shifted in Patrick's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of the unspoken sentiment behind Quentin's words. He glanced at Kathleen, then back to Quentin. "And what about Wellen?" he asked. "He won't take kindly to being thwarted." "Men like Wellen rely on others' desperation," Quentin replied. "Remove the desperation and his leverage disappears." Patrick sank onto a nearby chair, running a hand through his tousled hair. "I made a mess of things last night," he admitted. "Wellen kept the whiskey flowing, and before I knew it, I was signing preliminary agreements." "Preliminary but not binding," Kathleen clarified, hope edging her voice. "Not without your signature, no." Patrick looked up at his sister, genuine remorse in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Katie. I thought I was doing what was necessary. I didn't see another way out." Kathleen's expression softened. "There's always another way, if we're willing to work for it." Patrick's gaze shifted to Quentin. "You're serious about this partnership. You'd invest your savings in our failing ranch." "I wouldn't call it failing," Quentin corrected. "Struggling, yes, but with good bones and potential. The land is sound, the water right secure. With the right management and some hard work, it could thrive again." A fragile hope began to build between the three of them as they discussed possibilities. Modest at first, focusing on essential repairs and small-scale cattle operations, with an eye toward gradual expansion as finances permitted. By mid-morning, a tentative plan had taken shape, contingent on Patrick's commitment to sobriety and full participation in the ranch's rebuilding. "Wellen won't give up easily," Patrick warned as they concluded their discussion. "He's used to getting what he wants." "Then he's overdue for disappointment," Quentin replied with a slight smile. "Speaking of which, I expect he'll be calling soon to follow up on last night's business." As if summoned by the mention, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the morning haze, they could make out Wellen and two companions riding toward the ranch house. "Right on schedule," Kathleen murmured, rising to her feet. "Are we agreed, then, on the partnership and our response to Wellen?" Patrick nodded, standing alongside his sister with newfound resolve. "Agreed." Quentin moved to Kathleen's other side, presenting a united front as Wellen and his men reined in before the porch. The rancher's expression darkened as he took in the tableau before him. "Good morning," Wellen called, his tone falsely pleasant. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our discussion, Mr. Sullivan." Patrick stepped forward, his posture straight despite his lingering hangover. "I have, Mr. Wellen, and I've decided not to proceed with the sale." Wellen's smile thinned dangerously. "That's unfortunate, given the preliminary agreement you signed last night." "An agreement made under duress and the influence of alcohol," Kathleen interjected. "Any court would invalidate it immediately." "Perhaps," Wellen conceded. "But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Can you afford either, Miss Sullivan?" "That's no longer your concern," Quentin stated, moving forward to stand beside the siblings. "The Sullivan Ranch is not for sale, not now, not in the future." Wellen's gaze shifted to Quentin, cold assessment in his eyes. "I see, the drifter has decided to play rancher." His tone dripped with contempt. "Do you imagine a few years pushing cattle qualifies you to run a struggling operation like this?" "I imagine partnership, hard work, and determination qualify us to decide our own future," Quentin replied evenly, "without interference from those who seek to profit from others' misfortune." For a tense moment, Welland seemed ready to escalate the confrontation. His men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Then unexpectedly he laughed, a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. "Partnership, how quaint." He looked between the three of them with calculated disdain. "Well, enjoy your noble experiment in cooperation. When it inevitably fails, my offer will stand, though perhaps not at the same generous terms." "We'll take our chances," Patrick replied, a new steadiness in his voice. Welland nodded curtly, "As you wish. But remember this, Sullivan, the frontier doesn't reward sentimentality or foolish pride. It rewards those who recognize the changing times and adapt accordingly." With that parting shot, he wheeled his horse and departed, his men following close behind. As the dust settled in their wake, Kathleen let out a long, shaky breath. "That went better than expected," she murmured. "He'll be back," Patrick warned, "in some form or another." "And we'll be ready," Quentin assured them. "Together." The word hung in the air, weighted with promise. Kathleen's eyes met Quentin's, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. They had chosen their path, not the easiest one, perhaps, but one that offered the possibility of building something meaningful from the remnants of what had been lost. As the weeks passed, the Sullivan Ranch slowly began to transform. With Quentin's savings providing modest capital and his experience guiding their efforts, essential repairs were completed on the barn and outbuildings. Patrick, true to his word, remained sober, working alongside Quentin from dawn to dusk to restore what years of neglect had damaged. Kathleen continued her work at the Bull's Horn, though now with a defined end date, just long enough to build additional operating funds for the ranch. Her demeanor had changed subtly, the defensive pride replaced by quiet confidence as she witnessed their progress each day. The partnership agreement was formalized with Sheriff Daniels as witness, granting Quentin a 1/3 stake in the ranch in exchange for his investment and expertise. It was a business arrangement on paper, but all three knew it represented something more profound, a commitment to building a future together. Welland maintained his distance, though rumors reached them of his continued expansion elsewhere in the territory. Whether he had truly abandoned his interest in the Sullivan property or was simply biding his time remained unclear, but the immediate threat had receded. One evening, as autumn painted the distant hills with gold and crimson, Quentin found Kathleen standing alone in the barn. She held a lantern aloft, its warm glow illuminating her features as she studied something on the workbench before her. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't hear his approach. "Kathleen," he called softly. She started, turning quickly with the lantern raised high. The movement sent shadows dancing across the barn walls, giving the moment an almost ethereal quality. "Quentin," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. "I didn't hear you come in." He approached slowly, curious about her solitary vigil. "What are you doing out here so late?" Her expression held a mixture of determination and vulnerability that stirred something deep within him. "I was about to burn these," she said, gesturing to papers spread across the workbench. "Father's old debts, the last of them, we've finally cleared them all." Quentin recognized the significance of the moment, a symbolic laying to rest of the burdens that had haunted her for so long. "That's worth celebrating," he said softly. "It is," she smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But I found myself hesitating. It feels like closing a chapter on everything that was." "To make room for everything that will be," he suggested gently. She nodded, her gaze returning to the papers. "Patrick's gone to town to share the news with Sheriff Daniels. He suggested we might host a small gathering soon, invite the neighbors, show that the Sullivan Ranch is back on solid footing." "A fine idea," Quentin agreed. "You've both worked hard to reach this point." "We've all worked hard," she corrected, her eyes meeting his with warmth. "I couldn't have done this without you, Quentin." "You would have found a way," he assured her. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Kathleen Sullivan." She set the lantern down carefully on the workbench, its golden light casting a warm glow between them. When you found me that night, standing over this lantern with these papers, I was at my lowest point. Ready to burn away the past because I couldn't see a future. Quentin stepped closer, drawn by the quiet intensity of her words. And now? Now I see possibilities I'd stopped believing in, her voice softened. A home rebuilt. A brother finding his way back, a partnership that has become essential to me. The word hung between them, laden with meaning that transcended their business arrangement. Quentin reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. Essential, he repeated, the simple word carrying the weight of his feelings. That's a good description of what you've become to me, Kathleen. She stepped closer, the space between them charged with unspoken emotion. When you rode into Clearwater that day, I never imagined we'd be standing here like this. Neither did I, he admitted. I thought I'd be long gone by now, following the trail to wherever it led next. And now I know where I belong. His free hand rose to gently brush a strand of honey-blonde hair from her face. If you'll have me, not just as a partner in this ranch, but as a partner in life. Kathleen's eyes widened, her breath catching. Quentin Shaw, are you proposing to me in a barn, surrounded by old debts and tack? A smile tugged at his lips. I am. It seems fitting, somehow. This is where we're building our future, after all. Her expression softened into radiant happiness. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. As their lips met in a kiss that sealed their commitment, the lantern's glow surrounded them like a benediction. The papers on the workbench, symbols of a troubled past, would soon be consigned to the flames, making way for the promise of tomorrow. Outside, the Wyoming dusk deepened into night, stars appearing one by one above the ranch they would build together. For Quentin Shaw, the wandering cowboy who had finally found his home, and Kathleen Sullivan, the proud daughter of the frontier who had found the strength to forge a new path, the journey was just beginning. But now they would walk it side by side. Patrick found them there sometime later, standing close together in the lantern light, the past literally burning away in a small, controlled flame on the workbench. His knowing smile as he took in their clasped hands and Kathleen's glowing face needed no explanation. About time, he said simply, and in those two words lay acceptance, blessing, and the promise of a family rebuilt, stronger, perhaps, than it had ever been before. As winter settled over the Wyoming Territory, the Sullivan Ranch prepared for a spring that would bring new beginnings in more ways than one. The cowboy who had found Kathleen standing over a lantern that fateful night had found something far more precious than he'd ever sought on the open trail. A love that would endure through all seasons, and a home to return to always.